minute. I'm just triggering the webinar. All right, so we are ready. We're going to start now. All right. Hello, and welcome to the next webinar in our Plantae webinar series. My name is Jason Padilla, and I am your technical host for today's webinar. This webinar series is brought to you by the by Plantae, the open online community for plant scientists powered by ASPB. Next slide. I would like to give a special thank you to all ASPB members who are attending today. Your ASPB member dues help make this webinar possible. For any of you who have not yet joined ASPB, you can join today and use the discount code %STEM to receive a 10% discount on your registration. ASPB members get access to this webinar, and you can learn more about ASPB and the opportunities we provide at aspb.org. Next slide, please. This webinar is recorded, and we also have recorded tons of other webinars. So if you're looking for resource or content that would be around plant science, that might be you might just trying to maybe share or look for similar contents, please be sure to check out the Plantae YouTube channel, and you can find many other exciting talks there. Next slide. Registration for the Plant Biology Conference taking place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on July 26th to the 25th is open. It is a unique opportunity positioned to bring together members of the plant science community and to acquire the knowledge, network, and skills necessary to advance plant sciences and careers at all levels. Learn more about Plant Biology 2025 at plantbiology.aspb.org. And so this is a great upcoming conference that the ASPB hosts. And so if you're looking for and start planning for a conference to join next year, definitely start to explore Plant Biology 2025. Next slide. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items to make sure that you get the most out of attending today's webinar. If you are experiencing typical technical difficulties, please let us know about those using the Q&A section or emailing me directly at jpadilla@aspb.org. If you have questions for our guest speakers, please add those to the Zoom Q&A section. Our moderator will be sharing them with our presenter during the Q&A section. And if you are having trouble connecting or need to leave the webinar early, as I mentioned, this webinar is recorded and you will be able to watch the YouTube recording of this on our YouTube channel later on. So be sure to follow Plantae YouTube channel to receive notification when there's new content posted. All right, without further ado, I'm now going to turn it over to our moderators, the Plantae Fellows, who will facilitate today's session. Take it away, Plantae Fellows.
Hello, everyone, and my name is Carlo. Thank you for joining us today for the November Plantae webinar. Today, our webinar is featuring speakers Mary Gehring, Lothar, Kalmbach, and Sophien Kamoun. Unfortunately, Sophien could not make it in person today, so he recorded a presentation for us that we will play later on. Choosing your PhD or postdoc lab is a very important step in shaping your research career. And today we hope to explore this decision-making process and hopefully give you some valuable insights from people that have been through those steps and actually managed to have a successful career in academia. So today moderators are, the format of today's webinar is going to be the following. We're first going to have our speaker introduced, and after each presentation, before each presentation, and then we will have a 15 minutes Q&A session, after which we will have our concluding remarks. Today's webinar is moderated by me and my fellow Plantae Fellows, for the fun, Nivedita Priyadarshini and Abira Saho. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Mary Gehring. Mary is the David Baltimore Chair in Biomedical Research at the Whitehead Institute and is also a professor of biology at MIT, as well as an HHMI investigator. She's been a principal investigator since 2010, before which she was a postdoc at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, and before that, a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley. Mary is a leading expert in genetic and epigenetic of plant reproduction, as well as the biology of seeds. So Mary, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much for the invitation and to the audience. It's great to be here with you today. I'm going to share some slides, which are very brief, but talk about the process of both finding a great PhD lab and finding a postdoc lab. My comments will mostly focus on the US because those are the systems I'm familiar with, but hopefully some of this is also relevant if you're looking at labs outside of the US. So in terms of choosing a PhD, I've been through this both as obviously someone who got a PhD, but also now one of my roles at MIT is I oversee the biology graduate program. And so I read a lot of applications to our graduate program and have a good sense of sort of what is successful in terms of looking for a program. And then also I mentor students when they're choosing a lab. So for thinking about a PhD in the US, there's two aspects. So most of the PhD programs in biology and life sciences and plant biology in the US are not direct admits into labs. Rather, you're admitted to a graduate program at a university, and then many programs will have a rotation system where you work in different labs in the first year and then choose a lab at the end of that. So the first thing you need to think about is what's the right graduate program. And the sort of punchline is there's probably more than one right program. So I think sometimes students can get anxious about, am I making the right choice? But in many of the things that we do in science and in our careers, there's more than one good option. And hopefully that will be the case for you as well. So I think when you're looking at graduate programs in the US, it's complicated because there's so many to choose from. And so how do you start finding where you want to apply? When I was going through this, I talked to faculty at my undergraduate institutions. I knew I was interested in plant biology, but also biology more generally, genetics more generally. And so I talked to several faculty about, where are the good programs for this? And so once you have a list of maybe 10 schools, you're going to want to focus on, are there faculty there that are doing research that you're really interested in? And I would strongly urge you to not just think about, there's this one faculty member that I'm really interested in, that's where I want to go. You're applying to a program, and so you want a program where there are multiple faculty whose research you're interested in. If this is a program with a laboratory rotation system, as most are in the US. You don't want to rely on just being able to get into the particular lab that you're interested in, because for whatever reason, that lab may not have space, they may not have funding, or you may rotate there and you might find, this actually isn't a very good fit for me. So choose a program where there's several faculty that you're interested in. And then once you're there, or once you're considering programs, you really want to think about the structure of the program and whether or not it meets your needs or interests. So some programs will be more heavy on classes in the first 1 or 2 years. Some you'll be just really focused on lab work straight away. And so I think you, in all of this, in all of these career decisions, you need to reflect on what's important to you and what will be most helpful to you. I think when you're choosing a program, if you can, visit in person. And hopefully you're able to talk to not only faculty that are involved in that graduate program, but also lots of students. And so you want to find out how are the students in a program feel about that program? Are they excited about their research? Are they excited about what they're doing day to day? And do they have connections with their peers? Is there a community feeling in this program? And are they, I put it, at least moderately happy? Grad students aren't going to be happy all of the time, but you want to go to a program where it looks like people are thriving. So there's sort of what the program can offer, and then it's important to recognize that this is a very important time in your life. Many of you will be starting your PhD in your early or mid-20s, and so there's a lot of life changes that can happen during that time. And so you need to consider not just the research you'll be doing, but also, is this a place where you can see yourself living and thriving and enjoying being there? And then there are some very practical considerations like how much will you be paid? What is the stipend? And how will is it guaranteed? Is it something where you'll have to TA all the time? And so I think, those for me are the really key bullet points. Is it a program where students look like they're doing great research, they're doing well afterwards? Are you interested in the research in that program? And can you see yourself living there? Then when you get to the point of choosing the right lab for your PhD, once you're in a program, let's say you're in a program with a rotation system, I think you need to step back and reflect on what's important to you. So we often advise our students to sort of go through a worksheet of values and which values are important to them. So is it the lab environment that's most important to you? Is it the particular relationship with the PI that's the most important to you? Or is it, your excitement about the science that you'll be doing for the next several years? For me, the most important thing was that I was excited about the research. But for other people, the calculation might be slightly different. And so I think this is something that requires a lot of self-reflection and honesty with yourself about what you value. Just like choosing a PhD program, choosing a specific lab within a program, you really want to talk to a lot of people. You want to talk to the current students, postdocs, technicians, staff in the lab, to understand what their experience has been. And you want to talk with a PI. I think if you can establish a open and honest communication relationship with a PI right from the very beginning, that's exactly what you want to do. This is someone who's going to be an important person in your life, not just in the time that you're in their lab, but after you leave your lab and you're going on, leave their lab and you're continuing with their career, they're a really important person for advice, for recommendation letters. So you want to make sure that this is someone that you feel like you can talk to. And so I think it's great to seek advice, which is part of what this webinar is, but also go with your instincts as well. One thing that I see PhD students doing is often comparing themselves to others or seeing, oh, this is the hot lab where everybody's rotating. Maybe I need to rotate there. I would try and avoid that as much as you can because you're the one that's going to be getting the PhD. You're the one that's going to be in this lab for the next several years. Getting a PhD is really self-motivated. No one is going to tell you what to do. And so it has to be an area that you're passionate about, excited about, and where you enjoy working with the people around you. So then I'll just finish with a few comments about how do you choose a postdoc. This is maybe even more difficult than choosing a PhD because you're not applying to a program. You're sort of everything that's out there in the world is potentially available to you. And so I think the first thing is to think about what research area am I really interested in? Do I want to stay with something that's close to what I did for my PhD and build further and go deeper? Or do I want to work in a completely different research area? I think some of the best ways to do this is to go to conferences. So hopefully once you're in your, a couple years into your PhD, you can start going to conferences, presenting your works in posters or talks, and starting to meet people in various fields. So I think ASPB is a great conference for that because it's very broad. If you want to stay in plant biology for your postdoc, it's very broad and you can sort of meet people in all different fields of plant biology. Something that's really important is the timing of how if you've identified labs that you're interested in. One pitfall is that students can think, oh, I have to have all my work published for my PhD before I could possibly apply for a postdoc. That's definitely not the case. And sort of the longer lead time for labs, for PIs, the better. As PIs, we need to figure out, do we have funding for a postdoc? Do we have, projects? And so typically I would recommend that you start contacting labs up to a year in advance. And also, particularly in the US, don't wait to see, oh, does this lab have a postdoc position posted? Many of us have postdoc positions, but they're not advertised per se. So a lot of this works on an ad hoc basis. So you should identify PIs that you're interested, reach out to them over email or perhaps in person at a conference. And I think that initial email is really important. So I probably get one postdoc applicant a day, and that is a lot to look at, to deal with, and it's pretty obvious if someone is just sending a generic email. You really want to craft an email that talks about who you are, what you've done during your PhD, and most importantly, why you're interested in their research. It's pretty easy to determine whether someone is really maybe interested in what you're doing or not at all based on that initial email. Okay. And then again, just like with choosing your PhD lab, try and talk to a lot of people, talk to the PI, talk to everyone in the lab about their experiences, and also look at the history of the lab. This is harder if it's a new lab, and I would encourage you to go to new labs because you can do some really exciting science there. But evaluate what former postdocs have done and if that matches the sorts of things that you might want to do in the future. Okay. So I think I'll end there and let the other panelists have their say.
Thank you so much. This was such a great presentation. Now, coming to our next speaker, it would be Lothar Kalmbach. I actually personally worked with him, so I know him personally. He did his biology at the University of Mainz, UMIA, and Würzburg, and then he went on to do his diploma thesis in the lab of Nico Geldner in Lausanne, and then his PhD was working on Caspian strip formation in the endodermis. And then he went to do a postdoc in Cambridge as a Marie Curie fellow and SNSF and EMBO fellow in Jukka Hellerudta's lab. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. And he then got accepted as a junior group leader in the Department of Jugend Kleinwein in Freiburg. And currently he started as an assistant professor in Neuchâtel with a starting grant from the Swiss National Science Foundation. So Lothar, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I will also share a couple of slides, and so my perspective is obviously a little bit more European. I've been only studying and working in Europe, and I think a couple of things are probably different in Europe than they are in North America. And I think this is interesting to probably get a sort of perspectives from both sides. So I'm happy to share some of my wisdom, some of the things that I have been doing. So the question how I personally chose my PhD lab that was in Lausanne in Switzerland. And I had been, at that time, I had been I'd done my studies in Würzburg in Germany, then went to northern Sweden, and I didn't really want to stay there. So one of the questions for me was, I wanted to go somewhere where I can actually imagine working and living at the time. So this was obviously, I wanted to go to a place where I could do good research, but my primary motivation, in all sincerity, was really I was enormously into skiing, into mountain biking, into hiking, so I needed to go to the Alps. And this was there where I then ended up in a lab with a fairly young PI at the time. There was a small to medium-sized lab. I thought they were doing interesting and creative science and a medium-sized department, and so this sounded good. In hindsight, this was actually a very good choice, but in all honesty, that wasn't totally clear sort of at the beginning when I actually made this choice. I then decided to actually do a postdoc, and once I had decided to do a postdoc, one of the questions that I was asking myself, also was encouraged by others to ask this question sort of myself, is when going to a postdoc lab, actually, what could I be doing there in this postdoc? Then also, like, is this actually a lab and a place that would be better than where I come from? Acknowledging that better can be a lot of things here, and is very different for different people. And is the lab that I would be joining, is this a lab that is still rising, that is still moving upwards, that is still producing incredibly groundbreaking and creative science? And this, so as you notice, like, this was a lot more career-driven decision or reflections at the time. And this is how I ended up then in Cambridge, because one of the other things was also that I was relying on sort of being reasonably easily able to travel back and forth to Switzerland, because in the meantime, I had a partner who was on her own career trajectory in Switzerland. So this was very important to be able to go back and forth. So this was sort of my decision. So what I'm now want to share you is sort of some of the things that I think now hindsight, I wish I had known. And this is going to be a couple of seemingly binary decisions that I guess you're going to figure out is not that easy and is probably also, like, to some degree mutually exclusive. So things that I think you should consider, I mean, both for PhD and for a postdoc, and the weighing you give to some of these things, they might differ depending on if you're going for a PhD or a postdoc. But I think one of the things that was already evoked was like lab size. So do you want to go to a small or a big lab? And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. This affects like the supervision through your PI, the number of colleagues, the number of postdocs and techs you have. The more postdocs and colleagues you have, the more intellectual resources you have in this lab. The smaller the lab, however, the closer your connection with your supervisor would be. A question is also, like, what is the institution size? Are you going to join a small or a very big department? And this has a direct effect on, like, how big your PhD and postdoc community is. These are your peers. These are the people that you're going to spend a lot of time with. And this is sort of, in a way, also like your support group. And a bit related to this, like, what is the infrastructure in terms of PhD schools and networks, both intra as well as intra-institutional? And this affects sort of what kind of external advisors you may have, workshops that are offered. It enlarges your community of peers enormously. And these two things, they can very complementary to each other. So a small department where you maybe not have such a big a community that can be totally complemented with a big network sort of several universities that team up their efforts in PhD schools or other networks. And eventually, I think you should really consider things like lab age and the PI age. And I'm going to go to this a little bit more into detail. And so I acknowledge this is incredibly simplified, but if you think about sort of the academic age of a PI, like that from the PhD to retirement, or then when this person dies, there is a certain time when this person runs a lab. So there's a lab time that usually starts with the position that I'm now in as an assistant professor, and then ends with retirement, or in some places also where PIs do not really need to retire at sort of like 64 or 68. They can basically run their labs like to the very end. And this is, I think, much less prevalent in continental Europe than in some other places. And I think during this time, I think a lab has a certain degree of success, and this is very abstract. And this can mean a lot of things. It can mean output, I don't know, a number of alumni that go through, etc. And terribly simplified. So there's probably some sort of a trajectory where a lab sort of rises and then sort of like goes a little bit, sort of plateaus, and then probably sort of starts winding down towards the retirement of the PI. Some of these labs are incredibly amazing. Some PIs have already stellar PhDs and postdocs, and then they just keep on rising until the very end of their career. Some, it's the very opposite. They have produced incredible research during their PhD or their postdoc, but then seem to be unable to reproduce this kind of creativeness or success, like once they're sort of on their own. You have people that start out early and then just keep on going until essentially they passed an age where I would say most people would retire. And you have some groups and PIs that do sort of solid research for some time, and then sort of towards the end of their career, they're sort of exploding creatively and start making incredible research. So this is incredibly simplified, but if you now want to go to sort of like a lab that is in an upward trajectory, it starts becoming difficult because like depending on what the PI is and how the lab runs, like these might be very, very different times during the lifetime of the labs. There are some labs that are great environments for a really, really long time. Other labs that are a fantastic environment, maybe only for some time. And the big trouble with all this, of course, is like, A, this is incredibly simplified, and B, you're only going to be knowing this hindsight. But this is sort of some of the complexity that I think you try to navigate if you try to go to a good lab, make a good PhD or postdoc, and come up with something meaningful out of this and have a good time. So for lab age, there's obviously like there's new labs versus established labs. And in a new lab, the key difference is like your PI will still be evaluated. Whereas in an established lab, the PIs are usually tenured. They're a lot more settled. And this has some influences on sort of how important your success is to this. Like, I mean, in a young lab, as for example, now mine, my success as a PI is the success of my PhD students. So that can have the advantage of like a very tight and very close supervision and training, but of course, like can have the disadvantage of incredibly high expectations because, well, my success depends on the success of my PhD students. In an established lab, you're going to probably have a lot more freedom to explore because there's much less of this kind of pressure on the PI. But of course, like this can also give way to a sort of a sink and swim mentality within the lab, because it doesn't really matter so much to the PI if you as a PhD or as a postdoc are going to be incredibly successful or not. Like the career of the PI is not really dependent on this. There is also, and this was already evoked a little bit, it's also a question on the community knowledge. So for a new lab, there's very little community knowledge. For established labs, there's going to be a lot more. And this is on the one hand, like reflected on things like publication and the record of the alumni. What are people doing after they have been to this lab? But of course, like this also refers to red or green flags that you might want to know about this lab or this person before you actually go joining this lab. The second thing that I wanted to point out is sort of the PI age, and this is in very arbitrarily made, but I think like sort of a still young-ish PI might be somebody who is still sort of at least like 10 years from retirement, as opposed to say an old PI who's much closer to retirement. So why am I making this distinction? Because like if you're still sort of like at least 10 years from your retirement, usually many PIs in Europe, they still need to get at least sort of one more big grant. So there's still going to be an enormous amount of dynamic and upward movement in this lab, as opposed to maybe sort of if you go join a lab of a very old PI, where in the worst case, your PhD or postdoc timeframe may actually exceed the lifetime of the lab. There's of course like maybe the disadvantage or advantage, depending on how you look at it, in sort of labs that are incredibly successful, that are running well funded. The people are still reasonably young in this lab. It attracts an enormous amount of ambitious postdocs. And this can be good and bad. Like it means like it's going to be probably a crowded lab that has maybe a risk for some serious internal competition. On the other hand, you're going to be doing your PhD or postdoc with an incredibly smart crowd. There's lots of ideas around, so you might have an incredibly stimulating time intellectually there as well. Some of the old labs are sometimes ridiculously well funded. So this can be something like, in particular, my impression is in some labs in North America and in the UK. This can be great if you want to do a postdoc or a PhD and you really don't want to think about the money you're spending. In probably both cases, I guess, like labs that are established or sort of with reasonably old PIs, you probably have an enormous amount of unrealized ideas that are lying around. And this can be great if you're a postdoc and you want to develop your own career afterwards. Of course, like in the case of a PI that is still around for a very long time, you might run into the trouble that your PI actually becomes your competitor afterwards. But I think these are one of the really big potentials in labs that are very established. So this is sort of the lab side. I think you should really pay attention to a couple of other parameters that help you maybe to evaluate also the place you're going to. As Mary was already mentioning this, you're going to be spending a lot of time in this place. And I think one of the real considerations you should have is salaries versus cost of living. So this is, for me, two places that I know, in Lausanne in Switzerland and in Cambridge in the UK. It's salaries versus what I spend for rent and health insurance costs. And this is a massive difference. And I mean, so there's one place where you can reasonably well live from the money you get, and another place where, I mean, either you have the money from somewhere else, be it an inheritance, or you have parents that can finance you this, or you have other sources of income. But other than, if not, there are some places where you can actually start paying a lot of money for just finishing your PhD or your postdoc. And so some of the prestige places, they might be great places to be there, but they might actually be ridiculously expensive to live there. And the salaries might not necessarily be up to that, to what you would actually need. So this is also a bit reflected on the question if you're working on a stipend on a working contract, and this is probably more a European perspective. So in many continental European countries, you will have a proper working contract, or often have proper working contracts. And this has a number of advantages, like for your social security. It gives you an advantage of that in this case, you actually do have paternity leave, because a PhD or a postdoc falls into a time when you might want to consider starting a family. So this might become very important if you have a paternity leave that is paid for or not. But it's also in terms of retirement plans and sort of the possibilities on if and how easily you can actually transfer these retirement plans to maybe another country where you will continue your career. And I think the last thing that you should really take into consideration is also actually if you have a partner, like your partner's professional ambitions, because there are basically three options that you have. Like you either have a partner who sort of suspends his or her own career and then basically just follows you, and then it's easy. Then you're highly mobile. You can go wherever you want. Or you have a partner who can work basically from everywhere or from home. That's also great. Like you can actually take your partner with you. But I mean, your partner might also continue actually his or her own career. And then you do have a couple of geographical and organizational constraints and compromises to make that I think you should really consider and be sort of very open about this and when discussing this. So I want to sort of summarize a bit sort of my reflections on this. I think for both a PhD and a postdoc, you should really manage your expectations, not necessarily lower them, but sort of try managing them, because I think you cannot expect finding the perfect lab or the perfect PhD or postdoc. I don't think they exist, but I think there are probably PhDs and postdoc that sort of fit for what you're looking for and where you can feel comfortable in. I think what is also important to realize is that when you start a PhD or postdoc, you actually make a bet on your own and your host lab's future. So implicitly or explicitly, you're actually accepting a certain degree of risk when you start doing a PhD or a postdoc. And at some point, I think this is also important to understand, like you will at some point disagree probably very profoundly, both with your PI and or your colleagues. And I don't think this is bad. I think this is very normal, but I think what you should expect is sort of rather a reasonable conflict management, but not really a conflict-free PhD or postdoc. And eventually, I think you should really think also beyond the science itself. You may actually spend a lot more time with your PhD or postdoc than you initially planned. So I think like all these sort of non-scientific considerations and career unrelated considerations, like that you should really take them seriously when deciding on a place to go and spend now a couple of years on a PhD or a postdoc. And if on an academic trajectory, like at least like in Europe, you will be moving between countries, because this is how much of the fellowships work in Europe. So this is on the one hand, this is a great opportunity to experience living in another country and experience another culture. But of course, like this is also disruptive to your private life. So I think one of the important questions is like, is your partner actually okay with this? And how can you actually accommodate your respective careers? And this means that ultimately your partner can be either like an incredibly great ally to your scientific career, but can also be an obstacle. So this is something that I think you should understand and openly discuss. And yeah, so these were sort of my thoughts. I'm happy to take some questions then later on. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Thank you, Lothar. That was incredible. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and your suggestions. Our next speaker is Dr. Sophien Kamoun. As Carlo mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, he unfortunately is not here with us in person today live. But he has sent us a recording of his talk, which we are going to play shortly. Dr. Kamoun is a senior scientist in the Sainsbury lab in the UK, and he's a professor of biology at the University of East Anglia. He has worked extensively on understanding of plant diseases and plant immunity. And he is well known as a champion of open science, including open data, transparent peer review, and preprints to promote the rapid dissemination of science. He has received many awards and recognitions, notably the Kuwait Prize and the Lenin Medal. He was also elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2018. So since he couldn't be here today, we have one of his former PhD students and also postdoc from his lab, Mauricio Contreras. Next slide, please. Who works in his lab currently. He works on understanding the molecular mechanisms underlying plant immune receptor activation. He is passionate about open science and preprinting and firmly believes that we all have the power to change the research culture that surrounds us for the better. He will be participating in the Q&A, which will be right after we play Sophien's video that he has sent us.
Carla, the audio is not there.
Is it working now?
I think try playing it again.
Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, then I'll quickly.
It's a very important topic because the decision you'll make here with selecting.
We can't hear it again. At least I cannot. I'm so
Yeah,
sorry.
I think if you mute yourself, Carlo, then the audio stops.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the head up.
But let's start with the basic. What is science? Why am I a scientist? Why are you a scientist? What is the business of science? The business of science is knowledge. We're in the business of knowledge. It's important. It's important to think about that because if you think about it, our job is to do two things. One is to produce knowledge, ideally new knowledge that's impactful, that's going to help others build on it, that will have an impact on society, will push basically the frontier of our understanding of the natural world. But also our job is to communicate that knowledge. We communicate in many different ways. We write papers, we write blogs, we give presentations, we network with our colleagues, we go to conferences, etc. All of these communicating in the larger sense of the word is also part of our job. It's not just to produce the knowledge. So if you take that into consideration, the training you get as a PhD student or as a postdoc should equip you to do both things, produce knowledge, but also communicate it. So think hard about that when you choose a place to go to. Ask yourself, is this a place that balances these two sets of skills that I need to develop? Is it a place where I can develop as a scientist, as a researcher, learn how to do science, learn how to design experiment, how to perform these experiments, but also is this a place that values communicating science? Is this a place where I will develop my writing skills, my presentation skills, where I will learn to network with colleagues, where I have the opportunity to network and all of that? So the ideal environment really balances between these two. Trouble starts when there's too much of one and not the other. So that's the first tip I have for you. After that, the second question, I really want you to ask this question, the prospective PhD students. Are you really ready for the PhD? Is this the right time to start? There's absolutely no reason to rush into starting a PhD. I think that's a mistake that many prospective PhD students make. Don't rush it. Take your time to explore the world, develop as a person, as a scientist, experience various things. Go west, young men. I have a blog on this topic, Do Pre-Doc Young People. So pre-doc is one way of developing your research experience. Pre-docs are basically internships, usually paid internships, but you can do other types of research experiences, internships, work in a company, this type of things. Maybe even work as an RA. All of these allow you to explore before committing for the PhD. It's not going to hurt you to do that. There's no rush in starting a PhD. Find out what it takes to be a researcher, get to work with scientists on a daily basis, if you like it or not. Some people won't like it, that's fine. Build confidence in your capacity to do research. Widen your skill set. Maybe do a pre-doc on a topic that's not exactly your primary expertise. Maybe you want to develop some skills in computational biology, in proteomics. This type of things you could do as a pre-doc without huge risk, because it's just you'd be just devoting a relatively short period to that activity. Find out what you like, find out what you don't like, find out what you're good at. All of this is really important to figure out before you commit for the PhD, not during the PhD. And also, you'll be able to add a few items to your CV before you even start the PhD. We joke that a pre-doc is basically a postdoc before the PhD, and yeah, why not? You'll have some outputs that you can add to your CV. And that actually relieves a little bit the pressure during the PhD. So if things get wobbly during the PhD, it's not that bad, because you do have a few things on your CV before you even started the PhD. So you have a bit of a safety net you can land on. Another reason to do more research experiences before you start your PhD is that there's a lot of problems with academic research. Okay, let's be honest, let's not kid ourselves. And I like to argue that having actually bad experience, especially when it's during a relatively short period, is not a bad thing. You learn from it, you develop as a person, you know what to avoid, you know how you dealt with the issues. So I like to talk about how not to do science. What are the examples where science goes wrong? And one example is the type of lab culture where basically the students are turned into what I like to call Deliveroo students, who are just handing out the PI, the data that PI wants or requests, no matter how good the experiments are. And sadly, the literature is littered with these kind of examples. This is a case from the journal Cell. Many people worship this type of journals. But look at this particular experiment. It's a quite big experiment. So I don't have the time to get into all the details, but trust me, there's no control here. This lane is empty. Of course, it's empty because there's nothing really in there. It's a GFP lane. It's GFP. It's a GFP blood, GFP antibody, and there was no GFP proteins. What do they expect here? That a magic band will just appear? Okay, now you might be thinking, I went deep into the literature to dig out a very negative example like this. So in preparation for this, I went to look at last week's issue of Science, and it didn't take me very long to find problematic experiments. Not that bad as the previous one, but trust me, this also lacks controls. We like to joke about two-lane co-IPs. Really, they could add a few more controls to this experiment. It's not properly controlled. They can't draw the conclusion they did. Same issue, different article, bacterial growth curve. Well, not really bacterial growth, really, when you have a single time point, right? You can't be talking about bacterial growth when you have just one time point, and really showing the data as bar graphs these days is not okay. You should show us the underlying data behind this. So a lot of problems out there, right? So I wrote about this. There are toxic environments. It does happen. And sadly, many PhD students do end up in toxic environments. There's a couple of blog posts you can look at. And these toxic environments, where they happen when you have various issues, hypercompetitive environment, a type of supervision that we could call sink or swim, where basically the students are just left to their own devices with the hope that a few will make it. Lack of transparency in decision-making and communication between the PI and students. Not respecting work-life balance, the Deliveroo problem I told you about. Lack of publication. Some PIs don't really expect their students to publish or don't really push them to publish. It's not good. All the issues around authorship, labs that don't want to preprint, not good. Obsessive publishing syndrome, where the lab is completely obsessed with publishing certain journals at whatever cost, maybe like the examples we just looked at. And a PI who doesn't really care about your career, that's obviously a no-no. And then you should really look up the history of the lab. Some labs have reputation, bad reputation, and that's not something that you'll easily find by Googling it, but you may want to talk to some people who know about the field and know about the topic. So I hope we all agree that our goal as scientists should be to produce knowledge that yields predictable outcomes, that stands the test of time. That's really what we should be doing as scientists, and I hope you can find an environment that allows you to do that. And I think the goal in selecting a host lab is to find an environment that would allow you to be the type of scientist that you can be proud of when you get to retire from scientific career. Okay, I have also this blog about how to select a host lab for you, and you have to pick a pumpkin. It's not easy. Look at them. They're all kind of funny and scary. And it is like that. Selecting lab is not easy. It's difficult to find the right pumpkin. Maybe you should pick the one with the word thesis in it. That's a good one. But here's a checklist for you. And I think this is a useful checklist to help guide you select the right lab. And really going through this checklist will help you decide what you should do and how you should approach the problem. Networking, for example, is really important. I think early career scientists should really develop support network of peers, who could be students at your level or could be people you trust. But do identify a group of people you can really bounce ideas of, help stress test your ideas and your views and your rationale for your decisions. That's important. It's important to develop that kind of network. The topic obviously should inspire you, maybe should make you dream. I think science is quite a commitment. Scientific research, it is a commitment to do scientific research. It's really something that should make you dream. You should be thinking about this. It's hard not to switch off in research, that people say that. And if something that's bothers you, it's not something you dream about, maybe consider something else, it's fine. But be flexible. Even though the research topic is important, probably the best advice I can give you is don't pick a lab, don't pick a host lab based on the research topic. Do consider the other factors. If I were to weigh the two, I would put more weight on the mentorship, the quality of the host lab, the quality of the experience you will have over the research topic. Unfortunately, I think many students do pick a lab based on the research topic and don't put enough weight into the quality of the mentorship and the quality of the host lab in helping them develop as scientists and as researchers. So it's very easy to find out, really. Do your homework, do your research on the host lab, talk to people. A simple test, alumni, where are they now? Where are the students? What are they doing, the students who graduated from that lab? That's the best evidence you can have for the quality of the mentorship. Pay them a visit. Talk to other people who work in that department or institute. And reputations do matter, so do ask around. It's not something you can find by Googling, but you can ask around and try to figure out whether there's any negativity associated with host lab. Glam labs, well, there are labs that have big money. They publish big papers all the time. They're not necessarily the best environment for you. So do read the blog. You might help you make your own ideas about this. I think too many students are attracted like a moth to light to the big labs with the big papers. Maybe that's not the best environment for you. Maybe you want to be in an early career lab where you have a direct mentorship relationship with the PI. That might work out better with you for you than having a huge lab where you're just a small pawn in a big chessboard. Okay, momentum also is important. So do consider whether you're joining that lab at the right time. Some labs were hot 10 years ago, but things changed. The PI may have kind of moved on in his career or their career. They might be, that PI might be now having administrative duties. She might have become head of an institute or something like that, and therefore doesn't have enough time for mentorship as they used to before. So do consider that too. Momentum is important. And then if you're still unsure, consider a program that allows you to do rotations. It's a great way to getting even more experience and comparing notes between different labs and different lab cultures and all of that. Finally, keep in mind that if things don't go as well, you can always switch labs. Okay, that's all I have. You can check the blog. I was referring to it as I was speaking, and you can reach out to me if you have any questions or any comments. I haven't updated this. I mean, these days we're also on Blue Sky, not just on X or Twitter. So do reach out if you like. So thank you so much. Bye.
All right. With that, we will start our Q&A session. I do want to mention that we have many great questions that have popped up in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to all of them. In case we cannot, I would encourage the attendees to reach out to the panelists to have their questions answered. So we'll get started. The first question is for all the panelists today. What do you look for in a postdoc application personally or when you're evaluating them?
I guess I could start. So I look for evidence of independence as a PhD student. So I want people to join my lab who are self-motivated and where there's some evidence that they've been the one that really drove their project during the PhD. So when people apply to my lab, I often ask for letters of recommendation up front, particularly from their advisor, so that I can get a better sense of that. I'm looking, if there are publications, great. I think, that's important at each step of your career. But as I mentioned, there doesn't have to be work that is already published when they apply, but it should be clear that there will be publications from the PhD. That makes everything easier in the future. And yeah, I'm looking for nice people that don't have big egos and that I could see as part of the group. I like people who come from a slightly different, slightly or fully different research area. So people that can bring some new ideas to the group, or they've worked, I've had lots of people join my lab who've never worked in plants, but they're interested in doing that. And I really encourage those types of scientists.
Thank you, Mary. Lothar, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, so in general, I absolutely agree. There is maybe the thing what I would like to see sort of like is some sort of an idea what a person could actually do with me and also bring to me. I mean, a postdoc is a slightly different thing. So a postdoc is somebody who already has a significant amount of experience in, I don't know, a certain technique, be it wet or dry lab or whatever. And then actually this question also becomes difficult to answer very generally, because then it also depends on sort of what things I might be looking for very specifically. And then there's actually very likely that there's lots of postdoc requests that might actually be answered negatively, not because this is a bad application or something, but simply because it needs to fit sort of what the host lab actually is looking for. And for the papers, I mean, I think this should be underscored that it doesn't necessarily need to have a publication at the time you start your postdoc or you contact a person, but at some point I think there needs one, because in particularly, I mean, this is the European standpoint. If you want to be eligible for many of these fellowships, be it EMBO, Marie Curie, HFSP, FEPS, etc., you need to show mobility and that you actually have a publication. So, like it or not, that is somehow the currency. This needs to be not necessarily at the day you defend, but that needs to come reasonably quickly after you have defended or start your postdoc.
Thank you very much, Lothar. Mauricio, as a postdoc, do you have any suggestions as to what you paid specific attention to while preparing your application?
Well, my situation is a bit interesting because I guess I stayed in the same lab that I did my PhD, so I haven't actually formally applied for postdocs yet. But I guess, like Lothar said, it's good to have, I guess, evidence to back up your claims that you are a productive scientist. Yeah, in your application, that you can produce papers, that you can develop scientific ideas, that you're good at project management. I think it's good to have ways of backing this up. But I guess also, I mean, I guess from personal experience, I know of a lot of people who got good postdocs with they didn't necessarily have a very productive PhD. They didn't manage to publish a paper from their PhD, and they still moved on to amazing postdocs. So I guess it's also a matter of finding out a lab that would be the right fit for you if you don't have that kind of beefed up CV that you can kind of use to apply for positions.
Great. Thank you. We'll move on to our next question. If we want to change our field of work, how can we increase our chances of getting selected, considering no experience in the latter? And somewhat related to that is, if someone doesn't have access to the wet lab resources, how can we strengthen our chances of getting selected when someone has only worked in a dry lab?
I think I would like to answer this, and it sounds harsh, but this is probably something that with which you shouldn't then contact a new lab, I guess, because probably a new PI as myself has probably very precise ideas what they need. And I think for this, actually, like big labs that might be very broad in the scope of their research, the approaches might actually be the labs that might really be tempted to take on somebody. I don't know whether, I don't know. It's like, we're a wet lab. Why not get a computational biologist? I don't know how this works, but sure, I have the funding, come in. And I think this might be something more in probably easier in to do in established labs. Other than that, probably it's also, again, difficult to generalize, because honestly, I mean, people look for very different things, and also PIs will branch out at some point in their career. So it's probably hard to anticipate.
Yeah, sorry if I can just jump in. I wanted to add to that. I guess I'm doing a postdoc in a lab that's quite established and that's relatively big. And my PI, when he hires, he actually looks for people that have a completely different skill set to what we already have in the lab. So he actually wants people to bring stuff that are completely different, and he doesn't necessarily care if they don't have, or they don't already have the expertise that we have. So one question that he always asks during interviews is, what are you bringing to us, right? What expertise or skill set that we don't have can you bring to us, right? So I guess in that sense, changing fields in a lab like in a bigger lab that already has the skill set that they need, it shouldn't necessarily be a problem, because actually you're an asset that is bringing something new to a lab that they don't necessarily have.
Mary, would you
Yeah,
like-
I agree completely with that. And I think defining, like, if you're coming from a field that's quite outside of the lab you're applying to, defining why you're interested in that lab is important, in order to separate sort of, again, a really serious application from someone who's just applying everywhere.
All right. So I guess it's PI specific, lab specific. So reach out to see what the PI is looking for. Next question is, what to do when you're not getting replies to your emails from the professors, even after reminding them the second time?
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm guilty of that. It is right. It's at what point do you stop trying to contact someone? This happened to me when I was applying to postdocs. I ended up like trying to call someone on the phone. When they didn't reply to my email, they never answered or never got back to me. So at some point you just sort of, I think you stop. I think 2 emails, doesn't hurt to try 3 emails, but maybe beyond that, there's not sufficient interest on the PI side.
Okay. The next question is, are publications important when applying for a postdoc position?
So I just had one comment for the previous question, actually, if I can jump in. A lot of PIs, I know my PI is quite active on social media, so you can try contacting people on X or Blue Sky. Actually, I've heard a lot of people doing that now, and like reaching out to people over social media when they're interested in positions in their labs and so on. Just wanted to say that.
That's a great tip. Thanks. So yeah, the next question is publication important for postdoc applications?
Yeah, I think we already touched this. So at the time you defend your PhD, I mean, there might be very good reasons that there's not yet a paper, but there needs to be an okay paper at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess another thing that I wanted to add to that is pre-printing helps a lot, right? Because you may not be able to get a peer-reviewed publication out in time by the time you finish your PhD, but you might be able to get at least a preprint out by the time you finish your PhD, and that you can use that preprint as a way of proving that you have kind of the capacity to complete a project, get it written up and published and so on. So you don't necessarily have to have a peer-reviewed paper by the time you apply for a postdoc. So you can already use a preprint.
Great. All great suggestions. Next question would be, should one consider a postdoc position if their career interest is in the industry and not academia?
I think, possibly. So it depends. I see certainly our students here at MIT, some of them go straight to industry after grad school. Some are doing a postdoc and then going to industry. I do think in industry that the postdoc experience can be valued, particularly if you want to get into a biotech sector where you may not have that much experience from your PhD. That you can also think about where could you do a postdoc that you would both do great research, but also develop some skills that they might be looking for in biotech. So I think it's not a binary at the end of the PhD. You can still do a postdoc and then go to industry, but is not always required for sure.
Thanks, Mary.
I think I have a slightly additional point of view. I think you should not forget that the academic trajectory is a really easy or reasonably easy way to get into another country. So I think it's probably not really that terribly helpful to do a postdoc as such. I mean, besides for the mentions the reasons that Mary was mentioning, but what you must not forget is, like, if you say you want to get to, I don't know, a European country or UK or something, it's probably easier to get there first through an academic pathway and then start looking for an industry position there than directly looking for an industry position. So that might be sort of not doing a postdoc for the postdoc's sake, but just sort of like actually to get in a place where you might want to be on the market.
I guess the only thing that I had to add to that question is that, at least from talking to people in my area, a lot of people say that actually if you have a postdoc beforehand, you can sometimes negotiate better salaries or better starting titles, let's say, in biotech companies or in the private sector. I guess what I've heard is that, I guess, like, maybe Lothar, American, correct me if I'm wrong, the higher you are in academia before you make the switch, you usually can negotiate a better starting position at companies when you make the switch to industry.
Yeah, I think that may be variable, but yeah, certainly in some cases.
All right, so in the interest of everyone's time, we are going to take two more questions. One would be, do you have any particular advice for someone of older age returning to a PhD program?
I don't think I guess I don't know if the question is about the application or sort of the process of choosing a PhD lab, but I think being slightly older is not a negative. You're more mature, more confident, as was mentioned earlier, and yeah, can sometimes like move through things, are better at multitasking and things like that than students who may be coming straight from undergrad. So those are all positives.
And another would be, what should a student do when a PI starts to micromanage things, even things like when you're coming and leaving from the lab?
I guess, like, it depends a bit. I mean, ideally these are things you can figure out beforehand by talking to people who are in this lab. And then you don't run into this trouble. But if you are in that trouble, then I guess, like, in the very worst case, you have to go in touch with HR. But I mean, there's no shame in changing a lab. If you start your PhD and you very quickly figure this out, the earlier you change this, probably the better. So I think it's there. On the other hand, I mean, micromanaging, I think this can be sort of I don't know, maybe to some degree this also depends on the sort of, I don't know what the threshold is, or when somebody is thinking I'm now micromanaged, and the PI might say like, well, I just want to make sure that things are going the way I want it. So yeah. I mean, you have peers. I think I would talk with them, and I would very much suggest like get in touch with a lab you're thinking about sufficiently in advance to actually prevent this.
Yeah, I think basically getting as much information from current members, and also like Sophien said in his talk, from alumni of the lab is often a very good idea. And like Lothar said, what is micromanagement and what isn't often depends on, it's like a personal thing. I mean, some people have management styles that are going to work for you, and some people work for you and not for others, and vice versa. So it's kind of like very PI and individual dependent. But I think, I mean, obviously, if something that escalates a lot, and you may need to get HR involved or something like this, like Lothar said, but also, I mean, establishing an open line of communication with your PI and like saying like, okay, this is not working for me. Is there something that we can change? I mean, it's also something that can work, right? I mean, I think your PI having like a mentee-mentor relationship is a type of relationship where you're gonna have to be able to communicate openly with your mentor. So I think if it's too late and you're already in that situation and you weren't able to do the due diligence beforehand and you already find yourself there, do try to talk about this openly with your PI. And if everything fails, like Sophien said, it's never too late to change labs or to quit your PhD and start over somewhere else if things are really not working for you.
Thank you very much. I think we will wrap it up here in the interest of everyone's time. So thank you all for your attendance. Thanks to the speakers for their time, and to all the attendees who joined us today. We had a great session, and I hope these advices from the experts in the field will be very helpful for everyone who's thinking of pursuing grad school, either as a PhD or a postdoc. So thanks again, and have a great day ahead. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Again, this webinar is recorded, and so you can watch it later on Plantae YouTube channel. And again, a big thank you to our speakers for participating today and sharing your insight, and of course to our Plantae Fellows who orchestrated this really, really informative and helpful webinar. With that said, I hope everyone have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Bye, everyone.